Yeah, it's a great pleasure for me to be able to introduce the speakers on this, our first panel. And the first speaker today is Emese Kürti, an art historian, researcher, and art critic, linked with the Artpool Art Research Center, the museum, and the Museum of Fine Arts in Budapest. She worked in the Ludwig Museum of Contemporary Art. Later, she was the founder and head of the private research institution ACB Research Lab and a visiting professor at CEU. In 2013, Kürti received the Best Art Critic Prize of the Hungarian section of AICA. She holds a PhD in film, media, and contemporary culture from Budapest University. Her dissertation, published in 2018, grounds a new narrative for Hungarian actionism based on a musical genealogy, and in the last few years she has been focusing on the trans-regional artistic collaborations between Hungary and Yugoslavia. And the title of today's talk by Emese Kürti is Artpool in Motion, the Archive's Path from the Underground to the Museum.
Thank you very much for the introduction. I will jump right in the middle because we really have to keep our timing. In 1981, György Galantai, earning his living as a graphic designer, was commissioned by the Museum of Fine Arts in Budapest for designing a poster for its event focusing on the topic of museums and monuments in the country. Avoiding any visual element, Galantai provided a textual minimalism for his poster, selecting a poem entitled Statues by the French avant-garde poet Jean Cocteau, translated into Hungarian. As the anecdote continues, the poem had stirred the sensitivity of the guards of the Museum of Fine Arts, who protested against the slanderous tone of the text and successfully demanded its immediate withdrawal. The small interaction between the artist attached to experimental practices and the humorless glory of classical art highlighted the conceptual distances between the two distinct spheres in the socialist Hungary. But how come that such an interaction between these cultural spheres could take place at all? How could it be possible that a politically stigmatized and existentially marginalized artist had been hired even for a small job by one of the most canonical state institutions? According to art historical narratives, György Galantai, founder of the emblematic Chapel Studio in Balatonboglár and co-founder of Artpool, has been one of the most exponent figures of the Hungarian neo-avant-garde. His position has been framed by the countercultural narratives and dissident ethics, in a somewhat dialectical relationship with the standpoints of his own historicization and personal narrative. The institutional model which he, together with Julia Klanicai, introduced to the local art scene generated a completely new type of methodology, strategy, and operational way, not really according to the romanticized notion of the underground public. As a result of contextual, cultural political changes, there have been shifts in the position of artists in relation to state institutions and their self-historicization processes as well, which, however, have not necessarily been reflected in art historical narratives. The statements of heroic narratives of dissident culture on the one hand, and the questioning of the authenticity of avant-garde positions from a postmodern perspective on the other, took the form of rivalry discourse. In this paper, I want to argue that Artpool's story illustrates a paradigmatic situation that in some circles of the neo-avant-garde and dissident artistic intellectuals, attachment to the zone of marginalization was far from unequivocal. In fact, Artpool's strategies were aiming reach to the first public sphere and did not value the exclusivity of the underground, but rather ambitioned to expand its limits and publicity. Accordingly, first I will demonstrate that the idea of Artpool as a private initiative lies in its collective premises from the very start, rooted in the self-institutional practices of the parallel culture. Then I will focus on the occasional collaboration between Artpool and the Museum of Fine Arts in the pre-89 period, which implies some essential questions related to their contemporary engagement and also affects the future perspectives of the archive. György Galantai's chapel studio between 1970 and 73 was an emancipatory experiment of the new avant-garde in Hungary to surpass the confines of socialist modernism by spontaneous and improvisational methods that were at once strategic and in line with current artistic practices. The specificity of this chapel studio experiment that integrated the fragmented contemporary art scene and did not prioritize aesthetically had been outlined as a kind of socialist cultural project. In contrast to the majority of Hungarian neo-avant-garde artists, Galantai formulated his critical agenda against the cultural reality of existing socialism on participatory basis. He accepted socialism as a condition opposed to his methodology of critically adapting the toolbox of Marxism and exploring the gaps in technocracy. Instead of confrontation, the search for strategic loopholes, negotiation with the authorities, proactive self-management made it possible for the chapel studio to survive for 4 years. As he formulated retrospectively, I never wanted to be a partisan. I just wanted to see a different world than what I saw here. By establishing an exhibition space, program venue, and subcultural meeting place, Galantai modeled the operation of an independent intellectual space and filled the missing infrastructure for progressive artist collectives in Hungary. These intentions and principles, which concern the criteria of artistic research, community functions, and information sharing, shifted from 1979 to the Artpool project, which he grounded together, as we know, with Julia Klanicai. Started in the founder's studio apartment, the archive was based on the archival material accumulated in connection with this chapel studio project and the engaged documentation of the parallel culture. The archive operated through a hybrid methodology of self-documentation and the active archive concept that generated documents through artistic practice, exchange, and exhibition program. The direction of scale-up has been interpreted by Galantai's diary records at the time of the foundation, which on the one hand showed a very expansive intention towards the documentation and preservation of knowledge, and on the other hand used the terms archive and museum as synonyms. The concept of the museum plays a central role in the emerging institutional utopia of Artpool, for which archival work and the so-called periodic spaces represent a kind of preparatory phase and structure. Galantai was unfamiliar with the museum critique of the late 1960s. His poetic plans for the museum archive resulted from a resonance with the needs of the contemporary art scene. According to the contemporary statement by the founders, Artpool was not primarily concerned with the philosophy of denial, the dissatisfaction with patterns of official culture, but reacted to the need for independent intellectual functioning, and secondly, performed a criticism of the inner politics of Hungarian avant-garde, its position struggles, transparency, and knowledge sharing. In the mid-80s, Artpool created the impression of a complex private institution. Besides classical archival activities, published a magazine called Artpool Letters, organized international exhibitions, and operated an underground pseudo-radio station that exchanged artistic audio tapes. Another level of institutionalization would have been an interdisciplinary organization that Galantai and Klanicai wanted to launch under the name of Association for Contemporary Art, as a kind of consequence of the success of the magazine. The Ministry of Culture rejected the legalization of the initiative in 1985 on the ground that the state already provides the cultural functions envisaged. After this rejection, it may have seemed somewhat unexpected that in 1987 the same ministry had recommended a second request for the association, and the first steps was taken to establish it as a public institution. But the process of change of regime eventually invalidated the original goals. This moment also indicates that Artpool was founded during a period of aesthetic and political change documented by the archive itself. The relationship between art and political power moved away from the highly repressive period of the 80s-70s, when the cultural politics still insisted on the practice of ideological control, relied on the conceptual framework of socialist realism. However, since the early 80s, this relationship has taken a different configuration, and the party has given cultural control to actors who were acceptable by the majority of the contemporary art scene and had a functioning international network. Political power essentially relinquished control of culture, which contributed to allowing previously blacklisted artists to enter the state institutional system, even though the artists themselves did not necessarily experience the process of matting. Still, some of the artists known as marginalized in the 1970s were increasingly exhibited in large state institutions. And in 1980, 1986, they even represented the country in the Hungarian pavilion of the Venice Biennial. As regards the position of Galantai and Artpool, the fluctuation of cultural policy influenced by Cold War conditions was often overridden by personal relationships, curatorial commitments, and semi-illegal channels. As an experimental artist, Galantai was invited to a few museum group exhibitions in the mid-80s to the Hungarian National Gallery and Museum of Fine Arts. But finally, he was included in the exhibition program of the Museum of Fine Arts. No, I have to go back, yeah? With his unique artist stamp collection in Hungary. Like other Eastern European artists, he was attracted by the promise of horizontality offered by correspondence and mail art, and carried a huge amount of postal exchanges under Artpool's institutional brand. It is from this orientation that the World Art Post International Artist Stamp Program emerged, and from its hundreds of examples, he organized an exhibition in 1982 at an alternative exhibition space in Budapest. But in 1987, the young curator of the Museum of Fine Arts, Judith Gesko, organized an exhibition series. I have to go back. Sorry, yes. Entitled Contemporary Art in Hungarian Private Collections, and after an ex-libris show, she had approached György Galantai as an art collector in order to exhibit Artpool's stamp collection. The curator's invitation came just 3 years after Artpool initiated and presented its international mail art exhibition, Hungary Can Be Yours, in Young Artists Club, which entered art history as the last forbidden event before the change of the regime. Ironically, the recent scandal obscured the memory of an earlier scandal, the Chapel Studio, so the curator, who was familiar with Artpool's activity, with a tricky solution invited Galantai personally, not Artpool, to collaborate in the museum exhibition series. The stamp images, the first major collaboration between Artpool and Museum of Fine Arts, featured not only existing works from the collection, but also stamped works that were sent to Artpool by the members of its network, especially for this exhibition. It was a kind of continuation of this exhibition from 2007. What the presence in the museum meant to György Galantai in the 80s and how his contemporaries interpreted the underground Artpool's museum project can be reconstructed from related historical sources. Primarily from Galantai's own project, the 1980s Mukina performance with Julia Klanicai, which was realized together with the Italian artist G.A. Cavellini in the symbolic public space of Budapest on Heroes Square between Museum of Fine Arts and the Kunsthalle. In his living sculpture concept, Galante interpreted the two symbolic buildings of art as the delegates of the past and the present, respectively, which simultaneously provided a historical, political, and artistic context for the performance. Later, they presented a second episode for their performance entitled Confrontation, as a walk in the Székesfehérvár Museum, countryside, where the performers confronted the inaccessible hermetic museum display with the lived temporality of contemporary art. With artist names from Giotto and Cimabue to Cavellini and Galantai inscribed on their white dress, the body of performers acted like a living counter-museum. According to this paradigm, the Museum of Fine Arts was an institution in the 80s whose collection from antiquity to the 19th century represented a kind of discursive distance and asylum from contemporary dilemmas. For Galantai, the museum was as much a place for immanent culture as for some of his contemporaries like Ákos Birkás or Judith Keller, for example. I still have a lot. 5 minutes, okay. But this is a very important part. Although officially he was invited to the museum program as a private individual, contemporaries responded to the symbolic turn that Galantai, a representative of the former neo-avant-garde scene and founder of Artpool, had been cooperating with an institution at the top of the state hierarchy. In contemporary discourses, the phenomenon of avant-garde and post-avant-garde musealization has been linked to the issues of rehabilitation of formerly neglected neo-avant-garde practices. The dilemma in this regard was expressed by Géza Pernetsky. I quote, "The moral of the exhibiting artist is rather ambivalent. On the one hand, the above-described quasi-ideological background anonymously advises the male artist to avoid official exhibitions, reach galleries and high-prestige museums, in fear of losing his independence. On the other hand, every male artist has experienced the humiliation with which the institutionalized artistic colony flatters all those who are excluded from its domain. The question which arose was therefore if boycott or subversion is the most effective strategy. Has the museum eroded contemporary art with its canonical power, or has contemporary art broken the walls of the traditional institutional system? Contemporary art critics have responded to this still relevant proposition by welcoming Artpool Art Stamp exhibition as a progressive gesture of the museum, a sign of renewal. According to the emerging consensus, the event was cited as an example of a non-contextual collection that was able to interfere positively with museum profile. And now I will skip a big part. As its 10th anniversary approached, Artpool's institutional specificities and role in contemporary Hungarian culture became increasingly outlined, and did its double position in the first and second public sphere. In 1989, also Pernetsky tried to structure Artpool's history and mark a turning point in its institutionalization process around 1984. Looking at Artpool's current institutional status and museum integration, Pernetsky's conclusion sounds more pragmatic than prophetic. I quote, "Once a hobby, the collection has grown, become an institution, and the day will come when cataloging and maintaining it on a private basis will not longer be possible." This statement summarizes the main reason for Artpool musealization. The former underground institution, then NGO in the 1990s, outperformed itself and overstepped the criteria and conditions of an independent, that is, small and flexible form of institutionalization. We know the history of the crisis and the long negotiations which ended in the integration into the Museum of fine arts. So now I will turn into, so I just want to draw a parallelity, or to point on a parallelity with some archives from the region, or international examples, such as the Screen Artist Book Collection, which was purchased in 1999 by the Museum Weserburg in Bremen, or the art archive the Polish artist couple Kürti Tomasz Zaluski is going to speak about. In both cases, which I mention now, keeping the integrity of the collection was important, like the consistent enforcement of the archival profile and retention of autonomy in relation to the large formation. In case of Artpool, these aspects are complemented by the question raised in the 1987 exhibition, namely how the archive can intervene in the museum in a positive and future-oriented way. The relationship between somewhat distant figures that I've called discursive formations, to quote Foucault, should value the principles and ethics of the artistic archive performing the knowledge. Moving away from the logic of self-historicization, the future perspective of Artpool should benefit, or could benefit, from the historical, contextual, and methodological hybridity allowed by the museum's spiritual space. In addition to the classical practice of collecting and documenting, the archive should question the primary social context that surrounds it and continue with the active archive concept, which provides for both collection enhancement and presence in the contemporary art scene. However, Artpool's most important capital must be its own past, and its future should be determined by its own experimental, dissident, integrative, international, and local heritage. In the 1950s, and the last sentence, American correspondence artist Ray Johnson, an important reference in Artpool's history, invented the term motikos, an anagram for osmotic applied to his irregular shape cuts out. In György Galantai's interpretation, the symbolism of motikos lies in its representation of such forms that do not resemble anything than themselves. In today's turbulent reality, Artpool motikos reflects on the past of a collective-minded project, the future of which can be imagined in the practice of collective thinking. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. Do we have time for questions now, or will they happen afterwards? We do have some time for questions.
I just wanted to show some images at the end, since we do not have the opportunity for visiting our new place, unfortunately, but I really wanted to show you how's the place where we are trying to imagine ourselves and the future of Artpool. So Artpool team is approaching the new institution. There on the left, that is the new building. And some images from the interior as well. Our small but really important exhibition space of our own. And the fantastic storage with a very impressive technical possibility. And the collective itself in the new space. Thank you very much.
Are there any comments or questions? Clara.
Is there a project for formalized possibilities for the intervention of the Artpool collection into the body of the collection that we see here in this building?
Well, I think we have to continue this processual way of thinking and imagine Artpool as a process art, as György Galantai initiated and practiced it. So we had some plans for the new place with a starting exhibition, first of all, and which we are going to realize probably the fall of this year, presenting some important points and intellectual references from Artpool's history. And this is a start, this is the very start. We are planning to exhibit a really important piece as an installation and a space of constant or permanent creativity, Robert Filius polypedron, which is very important for the Galantai. And in longer terms, I think what is really important to be a really active part of the living contemporary culture, collaboration with artists, and as the way he practiced, but now we also have to integrate the new generations in the work and collective thinking of Artpool. So these are the plans, and this is the very start of this work. Thank you very much.